Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of The Crossroads. I am your host, Rashida Green, and this is the show for and about environmental justice and those who fight the fight with skin as melanated as the days are long. Knowledge is power, and we are breaking down stereotypes one episode at a time. I hope everyone is doing well under the circumstances, that you all are being safe, staying well. Before we get started with today's episode, I want to give some flowers, and keeping it current and cute, I'm going to give some flowers to Tabitha Brown. I love her. She's vegan. She's just got signed. She's doing her thing. She's been around for a while, and she deserves what she's got coming to her. And it's just a little inspiration for everybody, just to say that, follow your dreams. I know it's hard in these times, and when I would dream about things, if they didn't work out the way I wanted it to, like right away, I would just want to give up. And we waste so much time thinking about the plans that didn't work instead of, what you learned from it and then what you can apply to keep pushing forward. So I want everyone to be well. So I just wanted to give some flowers to someone that we've seen and can relate to and are proud of. And today is Tabitha Brown. So for this episode, we're doing a case study on two events in history, both which caused changes in legislation and that began the environmental justice movement. So both of these are taking place in the 1970s and the 80s, and there were very different outcomes for both of these cases. So I'm going to walk through the legislation and also capture why these are important, and tie it all together for, why we should care about this stuff. So the first place we're going to start is in Love Canal, a place called Love Canal, which is in upstate New York, in the city of Niagara Falls. An entrepreneur named William Love proposed to build a canal in upstate New York. And the purpose of that was to allow goods to be moved from Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. Love planned this, and he decided as well to include plans for housing around this area as well. But all those plans failed, and the canal was only partially built, and it was abandoned. The land that it sat on was auctioned in 1920 and used as a dump site until 1953. The unfinished product became a dump site for the city of Niagara Falls as well as the United States Army. And what you should know about that is, of course, the Army denies having anything to do with that. But some of the chemicals that they allegedly dumped were also used in the Manhattan Project. A company called Hooker Electrochemical, or just Hooker Chemical, received permission to dump chemical waste at this site too. They decided to take it a step further, to drain the waste, line it with clay, which is basically just dirt, like lining the site that they're putting the waste in, and just, resume to dumping chemicals. And eventually, they sold the land to the local school board for $1. Yes, $1. And the school board was completely aware that this was a site of chemical waste, years worth of chemical waste, and bought it anyway. So Hooker decided to, in the actual deed of sale, to add an extra clause that reiterated, in essence, that Hooker was not going to be responsible for anything that happened on the land at all, period. Even though that was already the case, as the school board assumed the deed, but Hooker just wanted the girls to know that there was a little bit of extra they should have keep in their back of their heads, because, you can't say we didn't warn you. Now, there's debate about whether or not that was stern enough. Like, maybe that wasn't enough of a warning, and perhaps that Hooker should have taken more initiative. I mean, okay, so that's that. Just put a pin in that. So the school board begins to build housing around Love Canal, and they had residents that began to move in. An elementary school was opened in 1955, And between these years of moving into the planned community, the residents were complaining about odors and sludge, but all of those were ignored. The government did not intervene until the 1970s. So just keep in mind that this land was used as a dump site. It was covered over and then built property and schools on top of it. And that started at or around the 1950s, and the government did not intervene until the 1970s. Okay. So let's get into some of the chemicals. So there were at least 12 known cancer-causing chemicals or carcinogens in the waste at Love Canal. 2 in particular are benzene, which is a compound known to cause leukemia, and dioxin, which is classified as a highly dangerous synthesized chemical. It is also a byproduct of polycarbonated biphenyls, or PCBs. And they come as a result of waste incineration, fuel combustion, and pesticide manufacturing, among other things. There were several tests done at Love Canal and of the air particles, the soil, and the water, and there was all evidence of these 12 carcinogens in the water in the Niagara River. There were a total of 200 tons of dioxin at Love Canal and 21,800 tons of just general toxic waste that's been dumped. So obviously this isn't good, So some dates. So in August of 1978, the New York State Department ordered all pregnant women and children under the age of 2 to evacuate the Love Canal area. There were high rates of miscarriages and birth defects found in families living close to the dump site. In February of 1979, another evacuation was ordered for pregnant women and children and children under the age of 2. And reports again showed miscarriages, birth defects, stillborns. In May of 1980, President Jimmy Carter declared Love Canal to be a health emergency, and 800 plus families were forced to relocate. And once again, in October of 1980, the families were again evacuated, citing mental anguish. So what were some of the legislation that came out of this? While all this was going on, in 1976, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act was enacted. So this was an amendment of the Solid Waste Disposal Act of 1965. And the purpose of this law was to manage non-hazardous and hazardous waste in what's called, quote unquote, an environmentally sound manner. Some of the other goals are minimizing the waste of natural resources in general, reduction of waste, and conserving energy. There are several departments or government agencies that are responsible for upholding this particular law. That includes the EPA, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Energy, and the Department of Interior. So why is it wrong? Maybe not wrong, but not effective enough. So the issues with this law are that the waste generator, which is going to be, in this case, the corporation, is given the opportunity to determine if their waste is hazardous. So they get to decide if what they're doing is hazardous or not. And they, in turn, are supposed to notify the EPA or other governing body if whatever they're producing or the waste that they're producing is hazardous. And they're allowed to manage what happens if something adverse were to happen. So they are responsible entirely, end to end, of what they're doing, if their waste is considered hazardous to our health or not, and then what's going to be done about that in the event that something were to happen. Next, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, or CERLA. So that is coming out of 1980, and this is actually the Superfund law. So this is the law that discusses, and just for folks' edification, if you don't know what a Superfund is, a Superfund is a site of extremely hazardous waste. What I just mentioned all the information about this particular case in Love Canal, this was the first. This was the first Superfund site. And this is the law, the Superfund law, that designated a list for all Superfund sites, and then extreme hazardous waste sites are put on what's called a national priorities list. Exciting stuff, man. I'm telling you what. I mean, it's it's just really crazy. So that's Love Canal. That's what happened in Love Canal. There was pretty interesting legislation that came out of it and response overall to this. So let's shift gears, moving away from New York to Warren County, North Carolina. The state of North Carolina decided to pick a small, predominantly Black community in Warren County as the site for a hazardous landfill site. And this site is actually called Warren County PCB Landfill. So the NAACP and other groups staged a humongous protest, like laying down in the streets protests, as trucks full of chemicals were coming to dump in this site. One of the protesters was former DC delegate Walter Fauntleroy, who was also arrested. It didn't really stop the site from being built or used. It was built and used and utilized. But one of the outcomes of the protest were communities of color and poor communities and created groups to fight against environmental burdens. And once Fauntleroy got out of jail, he requested that the General Accounting Office look into hazardous waste divisions and locations of the sites where these places end up, where these hazardous waste sites end up. And he asked specifically to put some oversight on Region 4. Region 4, which has 8 southern states, and that's Georgia, Florida, Kentucky, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Alabama. And research that was found that there were 4 hazardous waste landfills in this EPA region. And of those 4 cities, or the 4 sites where the landfills are located, the majority of the residents were Black. I mean, no shit. All right. So in May of 1993, citizens learned about the issues going on with the waste site, that they were unaware previously of what had gone on back in 1982, and that there were actually issues with the site itself. They were unaware of this until that point. And in 1999, the North Carolina General Assembly pledged $8 million towards the cleanup of the landfill. And the cleanup was completed in 2004. So the chemicals, because I mentioned polychlorinated biphenyls, just drop that in there. Those are, the acronym is PCBs, and they were the main hazardous material in the landfill in Warren County. And PCBs are endocrine inhibitors. So your endocrine system is responsible for regulating your hormones. And just like PCB and also its byproduct dioxin, they're both endocrine inhibitors. And they were, back in the day, they were used in electrical equipment, adhesives, flame retardant, all types of stuff. And as I mentioned, they can be found pretty much everywhere, in the air, in the water, in the soil. They were no longer manufactured or produced in America starting in 1977, but that was due to the large environmental health outcry. And they are very stable and they're fat soluble. And so why is that important? Well, if a chemical is stable, it doesn't mean it doesn't necessarily break down readily over time, much like plastic. Plastic doesn't readily biodegrade. Also, it's fat soluble, meaning that it can adhere to your fat cells, and it can adhere to fat cells in animals too, meaning that because it is in everything, you're ingesting it by the animals that you eat. Just putting it out there, not shaming. So approximately 60,000 tons of PCB soil was illegally dumped on the highway in North Carolina. So dumping was allowed at the site because it was considered to be a dry tomb. in addition to the harmfulness that PCBs have just because of their chemical nature, it became illegal, obviously, due to the health concerns. But that didn't mean that what had accumulated over time was disposed of properly. And in fact, it was disposed of illegally and being dumped on the highway. And in North Carolina, it was actually one specific person that was caught and responsible for doing that. But 60,000 tons of PCB soil were illegally dumped on North Carolina highways. And the reason that it was permitted to dump PCB at the landfill is because it is considered to be what's called a dry tomb, meaning that it is completely sealed off, so they say, and that it will not leak. And this was touted at the time as being so state of the art, but in reality, other independent research showed that classifying this as somehow safer was a complete mistake, and that it would eventually leak and contaminate the drinking water. Some legislation that came out of this, or I should say some legislation, but really just some interesting things that came out of this. So in 1987, the report Toxic Waste and Race was released, and no shit again, found that there's a relationship between waste and race, specifically that 3 out of 5 Black or Latinx people lived in communities near toxic waste sites. In 1991, the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit was held in DC, and I actually covered some of the bylaws from that summit in a previous episode. In 1992, President George Bush created the Environmental Equity Working Group. In 1994, Bill Clinton signed an executive order to address environmental justice in minority populations and low-income populations. And they focused on minority, tribal, and low-income communities to help them achieve environmental justice, develop a strategy to include programs, policies, planning, and public participation. Also, goals to improve data collection, identify patterns of consumption for natural resources, among other things. Semi-progressive stuff, I'd say. But ultimately, why am I telling this story? Why does this matter? So, as I mentioned before, Love Canal was the first Superfund site. And as of June of 2019, there are over 1,300 Superfund sites listed on the national priorities list. 413 sites have been cleaned up and removed from the list, and the states with the most have been New Jersey, California, and Pennsylvania. And again, Warren County was the first, or considered to be one of the first, environmental justice cases that started the movement. There is a woman named Louise Gibbs who wrote a book of her account of living in Love Canal during the crisis. And she states that industrial plant companies select areas for their sites based on demographics, which, doesn't sound like it's that far-fetched or out of the realm of possibility, right? And they do this, and they choose communities that they think are less likely to resist. And I just want to pause right there, because they're selecting people who they think are less likely to resist a large company coming in and literally causing adverse health effects from the chemicals that they are producing. I mentioned that the cleanup for Warren County wasn't done until 2004. So the case came to light in 1982, and the cleanup was not finished until 2004. Even going back to Love Canal. So the land was bought in auction and then used for a dump site, a waste site, for 30 years, and then continued through the 1970s when there was finally government intervention. So the question that I want to actually pose is, when you go outside, when you can go outside in these times, but when you're outside and you're looking around, what's close by to your community? What's close to the communities adjacent to where you live? Where are the landfills? Do you know where your local landfill is? Where are the wastewater treatment plants or any industrial plants? Where are those in proximity to you? And, what's the demographic of those areas around these sites? And to keep it current and bring it up to date, in March, the EPA announced a temporary policy to relax regulations on industry during the pandemic. So just for a little context, this doesn't impact the Superfund site, the Superfund law, and it doesn't affect the Recovery Act either. But the law literally states that companies with environmental compliance obligations should just act responsibly. They should just act Okay. All right. No surprises. A coalition of environmental groups are suing them. So EPA is getting sued right now because this is out. This is a temporary policy that they've allowed, and they are going to allow industrial companies to do whatever they want to and cite the pandemic as an issue, as a reason why they can't comply. Just saying, think about that. These are two examples of ample cases of environmental health injustice, and it will only increase with policy that allows companies to become even more lax about what they're putting into the air, what they're putting into the ground, and we are the ones that suffer adversely from that. So that's why it's important. That's why you should care. I hope I didn't preach too much. I just wanted to let you guys know that. So please take the time to be aware. Please take the time to consider. The sponsor for today's episode is Living Millennial Podcast. If you're looking for a show that provides insights and new perspectives to the Black millennial experience, and look no further, you can follow her on Instagram at Living Millennial PC, and her podcast is available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. In shout outs, I would like to give a shout out to Miss Corita Green, no relation to me. She is the founder of Glitz and Gems, and both of the S's are Z's because we're cool. So Corita is actually a already successful blogger, and she's a mother and now an entrepreneur. She is selling beautiful soaps, lotions, and body scrubs and what she calls jewelry boxes. Okay, they are shaped like gems. It is beautiful. Please follow her on Instagram. You can place orders. Her Instagram is _glitz in, just the letter N, gems _. And again, both of there's two Z's, one after glitz and the other after gems. Please follow her. Please support her. She's doing an amazing job right now. The purpose of me having this discussion about Love Canal and also about Warren County is really just to bring up and exemplify that these are examples in our not too distant past. We know what we're currently facing with the pandemic right now, how the numbers are looking as far as deaths, our deaths. And while the show isn't so much necessarily focused on that, it's more so focused on what happens when we don't, unfortunately, stay vigilant, where we're not paying attention to what's going on around us. And it's easy not to do that because there's so many things going on at the same time. This is going on, folks are unemployed right now or trying to save their business. Things are happening, and it's tough to figure out what to focus on. But that is just the importance of community, knowing that we're all out here trying to figure out the best way forward while we all work on different things separately, but it's all for a common good. So that's the purpose of today's show. That's the purpose of today's show. I really wanted to just bring these cases to light and shed some light on them. And I encourage everyone to read up more about this beyond what I've covered. And in general, shout out to everybody who is trying their best to cope right now and figuring out their work situation or how they're going to get from point A to point B. I know a lot of churches seem like they're doing some food donations, and I'm really happy and glad to see that going on. And I'm just really glad to see folks really pitching in and helping out. So, just keep your head up, keep yourself together, take care of yourself, whatever that looks like. You can follow me when I feel like it, which usually these days is never. You can check me out on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Crossroads Podcast on Instagram, Crossroads Pod C1 on Twitter and Facebook. All episodes are available on YouTube, Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts. And the link, as always, is in my bio. And I will see you all at the crossroads.